Hello Year 2, welcome back. We are going to be reading chapters 29 and 30 today. I wonder what will happen in these ones. Let's find out, hope you enjoy.
Chapter 29, Hatching a Plan. As Marvin huddled there, inches from Jorah's tiny masterpieces, a thin, sharp prick of resolve began to form inside him. He had to do something. But what? There had to be some way to stop this terrible theft. If only James were here. He needed his friend's help now more than ever. Marvin scurried down the table leg and across the rug to the desk. Swiftly, he climbed up and crossed its smooth expanse to the window ledge. The glass panes were filmy with winter grit, but Marvin could see the length of the street quite clearly. It was a tree-lined block with handsome brick and stone townhouses on either side, interspersed with shops and restaurants. Not dissimilar to the Pompaday's own neighbourhood, Marvin thought. So perhaps they were still on the Upper East Side somewhere. This notion comforted him, even though a few city blocks would be a month's journey from a Beatles perspective. He scanned the desk desperately, trying to think what to do next. There was an upright metal tin of pencils and pens, a pad of paper, a small tray of paper clips and rubber bands, and a sheaf of envelopes and newspapers. Marvin crawled over to the stack of papers. It must be Denny's mail, Marvin thought. He knew a little about the human system of mail because Papa had explained it to him several weeks ago when, tragically, Cousin Buford had been scooped up with Mrs. Pompaday's real estate contracts, sealed inside a flashy orange and purple Federal Express envelope and mailed to one of her clients. When Marvin asked where he'd been sent to, Papa said that the address was written on the front of the envelope, though the Beatles had no way of deciphering it. Comfortingly, Papa did explain that, wherever Buford was headed, he was sure to arrive by 10:30 the next morning. The family could only pray he'd survived the journey and made a new life for himself somewhere in the city. Privately, Marvin had his doubts about Buford's ability to make a sandwich, much less a new life for himself. But there was no point in dwelling on what couldn't be helped. Thus, Marvin knew that the writing on the envelope told the mailman where to deliver it. He hesitated at the edge of the stack. One of the newspapers had a white label stuck to it. Could it be the address of this apartment? The place where Jorah's virtues were being held captive? Marvin considered this possibility. If there was some way to get the mailing label to James, he'd at least know where to look for the stolen drawings, as long as he got the address before Denny packed up the drawings and left the country. It was a long shot, but the only idea he had at the moment, and it was certainly better to do something than to sit there fretting while the drawings disappeared forever. He crawled across the thin newsprint to the label. It had to be unstuck somehow. Careful to protect the lines of type, he gently chewed the foul-tasting yellow glue that gummed the label to the paper. Using his legs to lift and tug it, he eventually dislodged the whole thing. Pleased with himself, Marvin dragged the label over to an empty surface of the desk. It was slightly tatty at the edges and wet from his chewing, but it still held 3 complete lines of black letters. He spread it flat and set about meticulously folding and rolling it, exactly as he did with his blanket and towel whenever the Beatles went camping. When he reduced the label to a tidy bundle that was about as long as he was, he scanned the desktop for something to tie it with. He caught sight of Denny's jacket, flung over the chair. A scattering of Denny's grey hairs clung to the shoulders, just as Marvin had hoped. He crawled over to fetch one and then used it to tie the rolled label to his underbelly, cinching the strand of hair like a belt. As one would imagine, this made it very difficult indeed for Marvin to walk. He waddled back to the sack of mail and sat down under the corner of the newspaper, heaving with exhaustion. Now he just had to think of a way to get the label in James's hand. His thoughts were interrupted moments later when Denny appeared in the doorway of the study, speaking urgently into his cell phone. "What? What do you mean? Christina, I don't understand." Christina, his accomplice. Marvin shuddered with disgust. How had he let himself become so fond of her? What happened? Denny continued. They did? Just the matting? Oh, of course, with the tracking device. My dear, calm down. It's difficult to understand you. Marvin scooted out from under the newspaper to hear him better. Why was Christina upset? Their plan had worked perfectly. Well, it's a terrible shame, but why are you so... There was a long silence, and Denny leaned against the table listening intently. He rested one hand inches from the drawing of Justice, tapping the table lightly. Suddenly, he sucked in his breath. No, the real Jorah! Christine, you must be mistaken. Marvin scooted out from under the pile of mail, thoroughly bewildered. Of course it was the real Jorah. They'd stolen it themselves. Very faintly, he could hear Christina's high, frantic voice on the other end of the line. No, I was in the gallery yesterday, and I didn't notice anything amiss. Of course I wasn't looking closely, since you'd wrapped it up yourself. You're right. It was confusing, but my dear... Oh, I just can't believe it. Are you sure? Denny paused. So Christina hadn't known. So many feelings raced through Marvin that he barely remembered to hide himself when Denny walked towards the desk to get his coat. In the shadow of the newspaper, he slumped in relief. Christina was not involved. Her love for drawings was real. Her friendship with James and Carl was true. Yes, I'll come over at once, Denny said. I need to see this for myself. Marvin could hear another flood of tinny commentary through the phone, and Denny waited, one hand on his coat. It's too much to contemplate that Fortitude would be gone now too. Denny paused in heavy silence, but the idle movements of his fingers over his coat betrayed his calm. Marvin twitched, furious. What an act this was! If you're right, I must contact my director and the Getty's Board of Trustees as soon as possible, of course. Marvin could hear the anguished tones of Christina's response and remembered that Fortitude had been on loan from Denny's museum. It didn't even belong to the Met. That would make Christina's horror and guilt all the more keen, he knew. Denny listened for a minute, then said, No, I saw the care you took. I was with you. You mustn't be so hard on yourself, Christina. To be completely frank, I still don't understand how it could have happened. James's likeness was remarkable, but you're certain the original is gone? Oh, what a liar he was. Marvin could barely contain himself. Yes, I'm so sorry, my dear. It's just unthinkable. Have you notified museum personnel, the police? Denny waited. All right, that makes sense. I'll come immediately and we'll do it together. Perhaps you're mistaken after all. Oh, James is there now? He frowned slightly. He did? Yeah, I see. Marvin felt a wave of gratitude sweep through him. James was there. If only he could get to James, he would figure out how to explain everything. There had to be a way to save Jorah's lovely masterpieces before they were lost forever. I'll meet you in your office in 20 minutes, Denny continued. We'll speak to your director together. He clicked off his phone and reached for his jacket. This was his chance, Marvin realised. As Denny gathered his coat from the chair, Marvin ran awkwardly to the edge of the desk, careful not to bump the rolled label that was affixed to his belly, and dove straight through the air toward one sleeve. His body was much heavier than usual, and he barely reached his target. Desperately pedalling his legs, he clutched the fabric just as Denny yanked the jacket over his shoulders. Denny turned to the table, smiling down at the drawings. And now, ladies, I can't very well leave you out in the open for anyone to see. He strode over to the study's closet and removed the briefcase and a fistful of packaging materials. Very gently, with surgical precision, he set about wrapping the drawings in protective paper and laying them flat inside the briefcase. Small as they were, they fit quite easily. Then he clicked the briefcase shut and returned it to the closet. Marvin watched in silent dread. He could only pray that this was not the last view he'd have of justice, fortitude, prudence and temperance. A minute later, he found himself clinging to the jacket sleeve as Denny hurried out the door to the Met. Chapter 30, with the help of a friend. After a brisk walk that seemed to cover 10 or 12 blocks, Marvin noted with relief that they were close enough to the museum not to need taxis or subways. Denny ran up the stairs of the Met and finally strode through the door of Christina's office. There, Marvin took in the dismal scene with one glance. James and Carl both looked stricken. Christina was sitting at the table, her blonde head bowed, her hands covering her face. Her glasses were strewn in front of her and her cheeks were wet with tears. "My career is over," she said. "Over. Who will ever understand this? How could I have done such a terrible thing?" "Christina," Denny said soothingly, "let's be sure first. I've talked to you at least 6 times since the drawing left the museum, and up until now, everything was going just as planned. I just can't believe you made a mistake." Marvin listened in disgust. How convincing Denny sounded in his concern. "Look at it," Christina said dully. As soon as Denny walked over to her, Marvin crawled down his sleeve to one of his pants legs and from there to the floor. The bunched up label made this journey quite arduous, but as soon as he was safely down, he scrambled beneath the table. Now the question was how to get James's attention. He could try crawling up to his wrist as he'd done before, but everyone was so focused on the drawing, he didn't know if James would even notice him. He crouched near the table leg, mulling over his new challenge. Above him, he could hear the tense conversation. "They look the same," James was saying. "Nobody could tell them apart." Christina sighed. "That's why I wanted you to come. I was hoping you'd say I was wrong, but, just look at it. As soon as the FBI said they'd retrieved the tracking device from a cab in a taxi yard, I had a sick feeling in my stomach. I had to check the original to reassure myself, and then, well, I knew. You can tell too, can't you, Denny?" "Of course he can," Marvin wanted to shout. "He planned the entire thing." He couldn't bear to see Denny's sympathetic nod. "It's not the drawer," he said quietly. Christina turned to James, inconsolable. "You see? We could run all sorts of tests to confirm it, but we don't need to. When you've looked at his work for as long as Denny and I have, you can feel it in your bones." She shook her head. "It's that way with any forgery. Whatever the tests say, it's human judgment we all rely on for the final verdict. Because when you know an artist well, the thing that bothers you about a fake will continue to bother you the longer you look at it, until it becomes unbearable." Marvin saw her look at his drawing and close her eyes, and he flinched with the realisation that something he'd made could cause anyone such grief. But before he had much time to contemplate this, he glimpsed something shiny by the table leg. It was the metal tack he'd hidden the night he was abandoned in Christina's office. Aha! A weapon. Or, if not a weapon, an excellent poking tool. Marvin grabbed it with his front 2 legs. Holding the sharp point aloft and still carrying the folded label, he crawled with great difficulty over to James's sneaker. He climbed up the side of the sneaker, under the edge of James's jeans, and pressed the tack against the boy's bare ankle. No response. The distressed conversation above continued. Marvin tensed his leg muscles and vigorously plunged the point of the tack into pale flesh. "Ow!" James yelped. "What is it?" Carl asked in concern. "Ow, I don't know, my ankle hurts." James hopped on one foot, almost knocking Marvin to the floor. He dropped his knee and lifted his pant legs. "Did you twist it?" Carl started to crouch down next to him, but James had already spied Marvin. No, Dad, it's okay," James said quickly. "Oh, my foot must have fallen asleep. Pins and needles." He looked at Marvin, took the tack and dropped it on the floor, and then surreptitiously placed the beetle under his jacket cuff. Marvin released for a long breath. So far, so good. Now he just had to show James the address label. From his new position, he could see Denny examining the drawing on the table in front of Christina. It was framed identically to the original, but even through the glass, Marvin had no trouble recognising it as his own work. "I just don't understand it," Christina said. "I was so careful. I checked the drawing a dozen times. I don't know how I could confuse them." Carl crouched next to Christina, his hand on her shoulder. "They look so much alike," he said gently. "The museum wouldn't fire you for one mistake." She raised her eyes despairingly. "Denny, tell them. That drawing was worth at least $500,000 on a loan from another institution, and I put it at risk needlessly for my own stupid purposes." Carl shook his head. "No, that's not fair. You were trying to recover the one that was stolen. Justice. It was a good plan." "It was, Christina, and we all gave it our blessing," Denny said. "But I'm afraid this won't do much for relations between our two museums. The truth is, we were both responsible for the drawing, and we'll both pay the price for this disaster." Marvin could hardly stand this show of contrition. Christina gestured at the table, then pressed her fingers into her temples. "I don't even care about my job. The worst thing is that Fortitude is gone, and it's my fault." Carl rubbed her shoulder. "Maybe the FBI will be able to recover it," he said. "I know the microchip fell off, or was taken off or whatever, but at least they know where the drawing was up until that point, right?"
"Yes, but it was in a series of public places, a hotel, a church, an office building. The tracking device isn't precise enough to pinpoint rooms, and the drawing never stopped moving for more than a few minutes, so the FBI didn't have time to close in on the location. Or at least, not until the cab returned to the cab yard and they discovered the matting and the microchip on the floor of the back seat. They're still searching and retracing the path, but I haven't much hope."
"We need to start notifying people," Denny said quietly.
"Yes," Christina sounded hopeless. "I just wanted to give the FBI a little more time, in case... Oh, Denny, I can't bear this." "I know, my dear. I'm so very, very sorry." This was too much for Marvin. He couldn't stand the drawn look of fear and sadness on Christina's face. As if reading his mind, James blurted, "I have to go to the bathroom." Carl barely glanced at him. "Okay, buddy, you know where it is." As soon as they'd left the office, James lifted his wrist and brought Marvin inches from his face. "Where have you been? I couldn't figure out what happened to you. Were you in the museum? Did you get knocked off my arm somehow?" He shook his head. "We've got to think of a safer way to carry you around. Oh my gosh, I thought I'd lost you again."
Looking James straight in the eyes, Marvin promptly rolled on one side, exposing the rolled label. James stared at him. "What is that?" he asked. Marvin used his front legs to wiggle the label out from under its belt. He held it out to James. "It looks like a little piece of paper," James said. "All rolled up, like a spitball. Is it a spitball?" Marvin waited. "Is there something on it?" Marvin ran enthusiastically from James's wrist to his hand. Okay. James crouched down in the hallway, leaning against the wall. He took the label with 2 fingers and turned his hand over slowly so that Marvin wouldn't fall off. "What am I supposed to do with it?" he asked, watching Marvin. "Open it up?" He began to unroll the miniature paper bundle. When he was finished, he spread the crinkled white rectangle on his thigh and looked at it. "Gordon Perry, 236 East 74th Street, Apartment 5D, New York, New York," he read. Marvin frowned. Uh-oh. So the label didn't have Denny's name on it after all. But surely that was still the correct apartment. 74th Street made sense, just blocks from the Met. "Who is this?" James asked, studying Marvin intently. Marvin ran round excitedly. "What's the matter? Why are you so excited?" James watched Marvin with his serious grey eyes. "Do what you did before when I gave you a ride to the kitchen. Go to the end of my finger if I'm right. Does this guy have something to do with the drawing? The real drawing?" Marvin raced to the tip of James's finger. "Yes? Did he steal the drawing?" "Well,
That wasn't quite right, but James was so smart he would figure it out. Really? James bit his lip. Oh, what should we do? Call the police? Marvin retreated to the middle of James's knuckle. No, that wouldn't work. The police would have no idea what to do with this information, and no reason to believe it mattered. James looked at the label, his brow furrowing. I don't know, little guy. Marvin ran to the tip of James's finger and stretched his legs out over the air. You want me to take you somewhere? Where? Marvin waved his legs frantically. Okay, I get it. Where? To this address? Good for James. Marvin knew he would understand. He stayed at the tip of James's finger, waving 2 legs in the air. But what if this guy is the thief? Marvin continued to thrust himself forward into space, willing James to get up on his feet and in motion. James cast a sideways glance at Christina's door. Should I tell them? Alarmed, Marvin crawled back to James's knuckle. He could only imagine what would happen if Denny found out they were on their way to the place where Jorah's masterpiece lay hidden. No, James sighed. I guess you're right. They won't understand, and then they won't let me go. He stood up, thinking. Okay, look, it's not far from here. My dad will totally freak out, so we can't be gone long. I don't even know what you want me to do, but maybe you can show me when we get there. Marvin returned delightedly to his fingertip. James looked down at him anxiously. Is this going to be dangerous? That sounded so similar to something Marvin himself would say to Elaine that he almost smiled, despite his jangled nerves. As long as Denny was there at the museum, they were safe, he hoped. He looked up at James, not knowing how to respond. Getting to the apartment was only half the battle, Marvin knew. Then he had to figure out a way to get James to the drawings. Clutching the label in his fist, James scrambled to his feet, took Marvin under the cuff of his jacket and ran down the hall towards the exit.